found out about the trust fund on a Tuesday afternoon in the most casual, careless way possible. Not in a family meeting. Not in a serious conversation. Not even from my parents. I found out because my brother laughed about it over coffee like he was talking about a new phone or a vacation he'd booked on a whim. We were sitting across from each other at a small cafe near his office. He was relaxed, confident, kind of calm you get when you know your future is padded. "You know," he said, stirring his drink, "Mom finally finalized the trust." I blinked. "The trust?" He nodded. "Yeah. 500 grand. Took them long enough." He said it like the number was normal. Like it wasn't $500,000 quietly reshaping his entire life. I waited. I honestly thought he was about to say my name next. That this was one of those moments where siblings laugh together about shared luck. Instead, he leaned back and smiled. "They said I earned it," he added. Something cold slid down my spine. "Earned it how?" I asked. He shrugged. "You know. I made good choices. Table career. Didn't cause drama. Didn't rebel." He took a sip of coffee, completely unaware of what his words were doing to me. I forced a smile. "And me." That's when his expression shifted. Just slightly. Not guilty. Not apologetic. Almost amused. "Oh," he said. "They said you got something better." I laughed nervously. "What does that mean?" He smirked. "Life lessons. Character. Independence. Dad said money would only hold you back." Cafe noise faded. Forks clinking. People talking. A barista calling out orders. All of it blurred into background static as his words sank in. $500,000. For him. And for me? A motivational speech. A philosophical shrug. A symbolic pat on the back. I didn't say anything for a few seconds. I was too busy replaying my entire life like a highlight reel I never asked for. The student loans I paid alone. The rent checks I stretched until they screamed. The nights I worked late because there was no safety net underneath me. The times I heard my parents say, "You'll figure it out," like it was a blessing instead of abandonment. "You're strong," Mom always said. "You don't need help," Dad added. Apparently, strength disqualified me from security. I looked at my brother again. He wasn't bragging. That was the worst part. He genuinely believed this was fair. "So," I said slowly, choosing each word carefully, "they gave you $500,000. "Yeah. And they gave me wisdom." He laughed. "Basically." That laugh cracked something open inside me. Not anger yet. Something heavier. Something quieter. A realization that hit deeper than jealousy or hurt. This wasn't about money. Never was. It was about how differently we were seen. He was an investment. I was a lesson. He got a financial cushion. I got a character-building exercise disguised as love. I paid for my coffee, my hand shaking slightly as I tapped my card. My brother didn't notice. He was too busy talking about how the trust would give him freedom to explore options. Freedom. The word echoed in my head as I walked out of the cafe. 'Cause suddenly I understood something painful and clarifying. My parents weren't trying to teach me resilience. They were outsourcing responsibility. And for the first time, I wondered what my life would look like if I stopped accepting lessons I never signed up for. I didn't confront my parents right away. Not because I wasn't angry, but because I needed to understand something first. I needed to know if this was a new decision or just the confirmation of a pattern I'd been living inside my whole life without naming it. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every version of "you'll figure it out" I'd ever been handed like a consolation prize. It had always sounded supportive on the surface. Encouraging. Almost proud. But now, stripped of its softness, it sounded like something else entirely. It sounded like distance, like permission to step back, like an excuse. I opened my laptop and started doing math I had avoided for years. Student loans, interest, rent paid without help, emergency expenses I handled alone. I added it all up slowly, deliberately, as if seeing the numbers together might finally tell me the truth I'd been circling for years. By the time I finished, my chest felt tight. Not because I was drowning, but because I had survived without anything they were now giving him freely. $500,000. A trust structured to grow. Protected. Managed. Meanwhile, I had learned character by necessity. I had learned discipline because there was no cushion. I had learned independence because dependence wasn't available. Around midnight, my mom texted. Just to check in. Hope you're doing okay today. I stared at the message for a long time. She didn't mention the trust. Didn't ask if I'd heard. Didn't acknowledge that something enormous had shifted between us. That silence told me everything. They hadn't forgotten me. They had categorized me. The next morning I called my dad. Not to argue. Not to accuse. Just to listen. He answered on the second ring, cheerful like nothing in the world was wrong. Hey, kiddo, he said. I swallowed. I heard about the trust, I replied. There was a pause. Just long enough to matter. Oh, he said. So you know. Yes, I said. And he exhaled slowly, like he'd been preparing for this conversation for years. We made decisions based on what we thought was best, he said. For who? I asked. For both of you, he replied quickly. The answer came too fast. Rehearsed. I didn't get a trust, I said calmly. No, he agreed. You didn't. And that doesn't bother you? Another pause. Longer this time. We think money changes people, he said. We didn't want it to change you. I closed my eyes. It was the same story, repackaged. My brother got security because he was responsible. I got struggle because it would build me. You didn't worry about money changing him, I said. He hesitated. He's different, Dad replied. That was it. The sentence I'd been waiting for my entire life. Not smarter. Not kinder. Not more deserving. Just different. I thanked him for his honesty and ended the call before my voice could crack. Afterward, I sat there in the quiet, letting the truth settle. This wasn't about fairness. It was about comfort. My parents were comfortable investing in what looked predictable. And I had always been the variable they didn't want to insure. That realization hurt more than the money ever could. Because it meant the gap between us wasn't accidental. It was intentional. After that call, something in me went quiet. Not numb. Not detached. Quiet in the way a room gets quiet after you finally turn off a machine that's been humming in the background for years. I stopped asking myself what I could have done differently. I stopped replaying childhood moments, wondering where I went wrong. Because for the first time, the answer wasn't complicated. I hadn't failed them. I had simply never fit the role they felt safest investing in. Over the next few days, memories surfaced with uncomfortable clarity. Not dramatic ones. Ordinary ones. The kind you don't question until you finally see the pattern they form together. The time I asked for help with a security deposit after my first apartment fell through. Dad told me it would be good motivation to figure it out myself. A month later, they helped my brother upgrade his car because reliable transportation matters. The year I stayed home over the holidays because flights were too expensive. They told me they understood. Then sent me photos from the ski trip they paid for him to take with friends. Conversations always sounded reasonable when taken alone. Together, they told a different story. I had been trained to survive. He had been prepared to thrive. That difference followed me everywhere. At work, I was praised for being adaptable. School for being resilient. In relationships for being low maintenance. All compliments that translated to the same expectation. Don't ask. Don't lean. Don't need. I wondered what it would feel like to be someone people planned for instead of someone they assumed would manage. That thought stayed with me when my mom finally called. She didn't mention the trust at first. She talked about errands, about the weather, about a neighbor's dog. I let her talk until there was nowhere left to hide. So, I said finally, are we going to talk about it? She sighed. I knew this would upset you. Upset isn't the right word, I replied. It clarified things. She bristled at that. Clarified what? That you see us differently, I said. She laughed softly, the way she did when she thought I was being dramatic. We love you both the same, she said. But you don't treat us the same, I replied. She paused. Then came the familiar justification. You've always been more independent, she said. You don't need the same kind of help. I felt something settle in my chest. Calm certainty. I wasn't born independent, I said. I adapted. She didn't respond right away. When she did, her voice was careful. We thought giving you space was respectful. It wasn't space, I said. It was absence. That word hung between us. She didn't argue. She couldn't. Instead, she shifted the conversation, asking about my job, my apartment, my plans. I answered politely, briefly. 'Cause I finally understood something important. They were comfortable with me at a distance. They just didn't like when I noticed it. That night, I wrote everything down. Not to send. Not to confront. Just to see it clearly. Every time help was withheld. Every time support was conditional. Every time my brother was rewarded while I was instructed. The list wasn't angry. It was factual. And facts have a way of dissolving denial. By the time I finished, I felt lighter. Not because it stopped hurting, but because I stopped questioning myself. I wasn't imagining the imbalance. I had been living inside it. And now that I could see it clearly, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't unknow it. The hardest part wasn't the anger. It was the recalibration. The slow, uncomfortable process of adjusting my expectations to match reality instead of hope. For years, I had believed that if I just stayed steady enough, calm enough, successful enough, my parents would eventually look at me and decide I was worth investing in. Not emotionally, financially. Because in our family, money was proof. Proof of belief. Proof of confidence. Proof of who mattered long-term. And now I knew the truth. Their decision wasn't waiting on me. It had already been made. I started noticing how deeply that belief had shaped my behavior. How often I downplayed my needs. How quickly I dismissed my own exhaustion. How automatically I told myself, it's fine. Even when it clearly wasn't. I had built my entire adult identity around being the one who didn't need help. The one who wouldn't become a burden. The one who would never make things awkward. And in doing that, I had made it easy for them to keep giving me nothing. A few days later, my brother texted me. Casual message. Didn't mean for things to get weird. I stared at it longer than I wanted to admit. Weird was his word for imbalance. Weird was his word for a system that worked perfectly for him. I typed and deleted several replies before settling on the truth. It didn't get weird, I wrote. It got clear. He didn't respond after that. At work, I found myself thinking differently about money. Not with desperation. With strategy. For the first time, I wasn't measuring my success against what I didn't have. I was measuring it against what I had built without support. And that shift changed everything. I opened a separate savings account. Not because I suddenly had extra cash, but because I wanted something symbolic. A place where my effort would accumulate without commentary or comparison. Every deposit, no matter how small, felt like a quiet rebellion against the story I'd been told my whole life. That I would be fine with nothing. That I didn't need backup. That struggle was somehow my natural state. One evening, my dad called again. This time, his tone was softer. "We didn't mean to make you feel less important," he said. "I don't feel less important," I replied. "I feel accurately prioritized." There was silence on the line. He didn't like that answer. Because it didn't invite reassurance. It didn't ask for comfort. It simply stated reality. He tried again. "You know money isn't everything." I exhaled slowly. "Then why did you give him so much of it?" He didn't answer. 'Cause there was no version of that conversation where fairness could survive. After the call, I sat on my couch and let myself feel something I'd avoided for years. Grief. Not dramatic grief. Quiet grief. The grief of realizing that the family I kept trying to earn had already decided who I was allowed to be. And once I let that grief exist, something else followed. Relief. Because grieving something means you stop chasing it. I stopped waiting for them to see me. Stopped hoping for retroactive fairness. Stopped imagining conversations where they suddenly understood. I understood instead. And that was enough to start making different choices. Choices that weren't shaped by proving resilience. Choices shaped by protecting myself. That was the moment my relationship with money changed forever. Not because I had more of it, but because I stopped accepting lectures in place of support. Once that shift happened, I started noticing how often my parents used words instead of resources, advice instead of help, encouragement instead of backup, praise instead of protection. They were generous with language and stingy with anything that carried weight. And I had accepted that trade for most of my life because I didn't know I could refuse it. I replayed old conversations in my head, hearing them with new ears. "You're so capable. You don't need handouts. You'll be better off learning the hard way." Each sentence had always sounded like confidence in me. Now it sounded like a justification for withholding. I remembered the time my car broke down on the highway in the rain. I called my dad, panicking, asking if he could help cover the tow. He told me to call roadside assistance and chalk it up to adulthood. 2 weeks later, they paid for my brother's car detailing package because he works so hard. I remembered how I laughed it off. How I told myself I was being dramatic. How I swallowed the resentment because I didn't want to be the difficult one. That version of me felt distant now. Not weak. Just uninformed. As the days passed, my parents' tone changed again. Less defensive. More philosophical. My mom sent a long message about how struggle builds character and how they worried money would ruin my drive. I read it carefully. Then I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. She never mentioned trust. Never mentioned safety. Never mentioned fairness. Only outcomes. Only optics. Only the version of me they preferred. I replied once. Short. "I'm not asking you to undo anything," I wrote. "I'm asking you to acknowledge that you chose differently for us." She didn't respond. That silence told me what words wouldn't. Acknowledgement was the line they wouldn't cross. Because acknowledging the imbalance would mean admitting it wasn't accidental. At the same time, my brother started making plans. Big plans. He talked about taking a break from work. About investing. About maybe going back to school just to explore. He wasn't rubbing it in. He didn't have to. Contrast did the work on its own. Every time he spoke about freedom, I felt the weight of all the years I had been budgeting survival. Not because I envied him, but because I finally saw how differently we had been positioned. One evening, after another conversation that left me drained, I sat down and wrote myself a question. What would I do if I stopped trying to earn fairness from people who benefit from inequality? The answer scared me, because it meant letting go of the hope that one day they'd make it right. It meant building my life without factoring in their approval or future support. It meant becoming emotionally and financially self-contained. But the more I thought about it, the more it felt inevitable. I wasn't cutting them off. I was cutting myself loose from expectations they never planned to meet. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because things were resolved, but because I stopped negotiating with a fantasy. The next morning, I updated my budget. Not out of fear, out of clarity. I planned for a future where my safety came from me, where lessons were optional, where pats on the back weren't substitutes for real support. And as I closed my laptop, I realized something quietly powerful. They had given my brother a trust fund. But they had given me something too, a very clear understanding of who I could rely on. Once I accepted that clarity, everything else followed naturally. I stopped updating my parents about my plans, not out of spite, out of self-preservation. Every time I shared something important before, it turned into a lecture, a warning, a reminder of how things could go wrong. Meanwhile, my brother's plans were met with enthusiasm and reassurance. So I quietly removed my life from their commentary. Felt strange at first, like leaving a room without announcing it. But after a while, the quiet became comforting. I realized how much emotional energy I had been spending justifying my decisions to people who had already decided not to support them. That energy was finally mine again. I put it into work, into building savings, into learning how to invest on my own terms. I read books, listened to podcasts, questions, not because I wanted to prove anything, but because knowledge felt safer than waiting for approval that would never come. My parents noticed the distance eventually. Mom called one afternoon, her tone cautious. "You've been quiet lately," she said. "I've been busy," I replied. "With what?" "My life," I said simply. She didn't like that answer. I could hear it in the pause that followed. "We just worry you're pulling away," she said. I thought about all the years they had pulled back without explanation. All the times I'd been told to figure it out. "I'm not pulling away," I said. "I'm standing where I've always been. You're just noticing it now." She sighed. "We raised you to be independent," she said. "Yes," I replied. "And now I'm using it." That ended the conversation. Not dramatically, just conclusively. Around that time, my brother invited me to dinner. He wanted to talk. Really talk. I almost said no, but curiosity won. We sat across from each other, the space between us filled with things we'd never said out loud. "I didn't ask for the trust," he said finally. "I know," I replied. "But you accepted it." He nodded slowly. "I guess I didn't realize how different things were for you," he admitted. I looked at him, searching for something. Regret. Understanding. Anything. "I didn't either," I said. "Not until now." That was the moment I understood something else. This wasn't just about my parents. It was about the roles we'd all been assigned. He had learned to receive without guilt. I had learned to survive without expectation. Neither of us had chosen those lessons, but only one of us benefited from them. When we left the restaurant, I didn't feel angry. I felt resolved. My path was clear. I would stop waiting for someone else to decide my worth. I would build my own version of security, but one that didn't come with conditions or comparisons. And for the first time, that didn't feel lonely. Felt honest. After that dinner, I stopped pretending this was just a misunderstanding. It wasn't. It was a system that worked exactly as designed. And once I accepted that, I could finally step outside of it instead of fighting inside it. I started noticing how often my parents framed their choices as wisdom instead of preference, how they spoke about responsibility when they meant control, how they praised independence when they meant distance. Every conversation followed the same arc. They would explain. They would justify. They would reassure themselves. And I would be expected to absorb the outcome quietly. That expectation disappeared the moment I stopped participating. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Just consistently. When my mom called to ask about my finances out of concern, I answered vaguely. When my dad offered advice about investing for my own good, I thanked him and changed the subject. I didn't argue. I didn't defend. I didn't try to make them understand. I understood already. That was enough. The more I detached, the more space opened up in my life. I started thinking long-term in a way I never had before. Not just about money, but about peace. About what kind of relationships I wanted to maintain. About which ones required me to shrink. That question became my filter. Being around someone made me feel smaller, more apologetic, more uncertain. I took a step back. Being around someone made me feel grounded, capable, and respected. I leaned in. It was a simple rule. But it changed everything. I also began to confront a quieter truth. I had internalized their expectations more deeply than I realized. Even without them present, I still pushed myself harder than necessary. Till felt guilty resting. Till measured my value by productivity. Letting go of their narrative meant relearning how to treat myself. Some nights, that was harder than dealing with them directly. I would catch myself thinking, you should be grateful you turned out fine. And then I would correct it. I didn't turn out fine because I was denied support. I turned out fine despite it. That distinction mattered. One afternoon, I reviewed my savings account again. It wasn't impressive by traditional standards. But it was mine. Built slowly. Carefully. Without anyone dangling it over my head. I realized then that my parents' trust fund had bought my brother options. But my path had taught me discernment. I didn't want blind security. I wanted earned stability. Stability that couldn't be revoked with disappointment or comparison. That realization didn't erase the hurt. But it transformed it. Instead of resentment, I felt determination. Instead of longing, I felt clarity. I wasn't behind. I wasn't lacking. I was simply on a path they never planned for. And for the first time, I stopped trying to merge paths that were never meant to align. The moment I truly understood what was happening didn't arrive with a fight. It arrived quietly, during an ordinary afternoon when nothing dramatic was supposed to happen. I was sitting at my kitchen table, laptop open, bills spread out in front of me, when it hit me how familiar this posture felt. Calculating. Planning. Preparing for uncertainty. I had been doing this my entire adult life without questioning why it was always my responsibility alone. That realization landed harder than anger ever could. 'Cause anger still believes something can be fixed. This was acceptance. I thought about my brother again. About how he talked about the trust fund like it was simply a tool waiting for him whenever he wanted to reach for it. How he could afford to think in terms of possibilities instead of contingencies. He wasn't reckless. He was relaxed. And relaxation, I realized, was a luxury purchased long before adulthood. It wasn't his fault. But it was my parents' choice. They had chosen who would be cushioned and who would be sharpened. And I was tired of being sharpened. I thought back to every moment when I almost asked for help and stopped myself. Every time I told myself they don't need to know. Every time I minimized my own stress so I wouldn't sound needy. That behavior hadn't come from strength. It had come from conditioning. I had learned early that needing less made me more acceptable. That being low maintenance made me easier to love. That asking for support came with an invisible price tag of disappointment. Once I saw that pattern clearly, I couldn't unsee it. I noticed how deeply it had infiltrated my decisions. I stayed in jobs longer than I should have because stability mattered more than fulfillment. I delayed moves, relationships, risks because failure didn't feel like an option without a safety net. I built my life defensively, not expansively. And no one had ever pointed that out to me because from the outside it looked like responsibility. It looked like maturity. But inside it felt like permanent readiness for impact. That afternoon my mom called again. Not to talk about the trust. Not to ask how I was really doing. She called to ask if I had considered long-term planning, as if that wasn't what I had been doing my entire life. I listened to her talk about discipline and patience and how everything works out eventually. And for the first time, I heard the gap between her words and my reality clearly enough to stop pretending they matched. "I've been planning long-term since I was 20, I said quietly. There was a pause. She didn't know how to respond to that. 'Cause acknowledging it would mean acknowledging that I hadn't been reckless or dramatic or irresponsible. I had been unsupported. After the call, I sat there for a long time, letting the truth settle without rushing to soften it. This wasn't a misunderstanding that could be talked through. It was a philosophy difference. They believed struggle was educational as long as it wasn't theirs. They believed comfort should be earned through predictability. And I had always been the unpredictable one. The adaptable one. The one who would figure it out. That phrase echoed in my head again, but this time it didn't sting. 'Cause I finally understood its real meaning. It was never encouragement. It was permission for them to step back. To invest elsewhere. To choose the path of least resistance. That night I didn't cry. I didn't spiral. I felt something far more dangerous to old patterns. I felt calm. Calm that comes when a truth clicks into place and stays there. I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence at the top of the page. I will no longer accept lessons in place of support. I stared at it for a long time. Then I wrote another sentence underneath. I am allowed to want ease. Those words felt rebellious. Almost selfish. But also deeply necessary. 'Cause no one had ever told me that wanting stability didn't make me weak. That wanting backup didn't make me entitled. That wanting fairness didn't make me ungrateful. I closed the notebook and realized something quietly profound. My parents had given my brother financial freedom. They had given me endurance. And endurance had kept me alive. But it wasn't the life I wanted anymore. From that moment on, I stopped waiting for them to change their minds. I stopped hoping for recognition. I stopped measuring myself against what they chose not to give me. 'Cause the truth was simple and uncomfortable. They had already taught me everything they were willing to teach. And the rest I would have to choose for myself. The real decision didn't happen in a dramatic moment. Didn't come with a raised voice or a slammed door or a final sentence that sounded powerful enough to quote later. It happened gradually, in small choices that added up until there was no turning back. First choice was emotional. I stopped waiting for them to notice my absence. For years, I had measured my distance from my parents by how long it took them to reach out. Days passed, I felt invisible. Weeks passed, I felt rejected. Months passed, I told myself they were busy and I was overthinking it. This time, I stopped counting. Not because I didn't care, but because I finally understood that attention had always been conditional. They reached out when they needed reassurance. They pulled back when accountability hovered too close. Once I saw that pattern clearly, the waiting lost its power. The second choice was practical. I restructured my finances as if no one was coming to save me. Not out of fear. Out of realism. I built a plan that didn't include hypothetical help or future generosity. I treated stability like something I was responsible for creating, not something I was temporarily missing. And strangely, that felt empowering instead of lonely. 'Cause at least the rules were honest. The third choice was relational. I stopped offering emotional access where there was no emotional safety. When my parents called, I didn't fill the silence with updates. I didn't volunteer struggles. I didn't explain my decisions. I responded politely, briefly, and truthfully. And that shift unsettled them more than any argument ever could. Without realizing it, I had changed the rules of engagement. They were used to me justifying myself. They were used to me softening my words so they wouldn't feel uncomfortable. They were used to being centered even in conversations about my life. Now they weren't. My mom noticed first. "You're different," she said during one call. Not curious. Suspicious. "I'm clearer," I replied. She laughed nervously. "I don't know what that means." "It means I'm not explaining myself anymore," I said. The silence that followed felt heavier than any argument we'd ever had. Because clarity doesn't invite negotiation. Around that time, extended family started reaching out. Not to ask how I was. To ask what was going on. They had heard fragments. Selective versions. A narrative where my parents were generous, concerned, confused. And I was distant. Cold. Ungrateful. I listened. Then I stopped engaging. I realized something important. Anyone who only hears one side and rushes to correct the other isn't looking for truth. They're looking for comfort. And I was done providing comfort at my own expense. At night, I started noticing how much mental space had been freed up. I wasn't rehearsing conversations anymore. I wasn't bracing myself for disappointment. I wasn't wondering how to phrase things so they'd land gently. That energy didn't disappear. It redirected. Into my work. Into my health. Into my future. I made decisions faster. Not impulsively. Decisively. I trusted my instincts because I was no longer trained to doubt them. One evening, my brother called. Not to brag. Not to apologize. Just to talk. "I didn't realize how heavy this was for you," he said quietly. I believed him. But belief didn't change the outcome. "I know," I replied. "But understanding it now doesn't undo it." He was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know what to do with that," he admitted. "You don't have to do anything," I said. "That's kind of the point." Through the call, I sat there thinking about how different our paths had been shaped. Not by talent. Not by effort. By expectation. He was expected to be protected. I was expected to be resilient. Protection creates options. Resilience creates endurance. And endurance, I realized, can become a cage if you never allow yourself to want more. That night I wrote a list. Not of grievances. Of boundaries. Things I would no longer tolerate. Conversations that required me to shrink. Advice that replaced accountability. Praise that masked neglect. Then I wrote another list. Things I wanted to build. Stability without permission. Peace without explanation. A future where money was a tool, not a moral lesson. As I looked at those lists, something settled deep in my chest. I wasn't walking away in anger. I was walking forward with intention. And that difference mattered. 'Cause anger still looks back. Intention doesn't. By the end of that week, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Alignment. My actions matched my values. My boundaries matched my reality. My expectations matched what people were actually willing to give. And once those things aligned, the resentment faded. Not because the past was forgiven, but because it no longer dictated my future. I understood then that my parents hadn't just given my brother a trust fund. They had given him certainty. And I had spent years thinking certainty was something I lacked. But standing there, grounded in my own choices, I realized the truth. Certainty doesn't come from money alone. It comes from knowing exactly where you stand. And for the first time in my life, I knew. The confrontation didn't happen the way I imagined it would for years. It wasn't explosive. It wasn't cinematic. It wasn't satisfying in the way arguments are in your head when you rehearse them late at night. It was quiet, measured, almost mundane, and somehow that made it heavier. We were sitting at my parents' dining table, the same one where so many important conversations had happened before. The same table where advice was handed out freely and responsibility was always deferred. Nothing about the room had changed. The furniture was the same. The lighting was the same. The polite tension in the air was familiar. But I was not. My mom kept rearranging her napkin. My dad cleared his throat more times than necessary. They knew why I was there. They just didn't know how I was going to say it. "I need to talk about the trust," I said finally. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me. My dad leaned back in his chair, arms crossing instinctively. "We've already explained our thinking," he said. "I know," I replied. "I'm not here for an explanation." That caught them off guard. My mom frowned. "Then what are you here for?" "To tell you how it landed," I said. "Not how you intended it. How it actually affected me." They exchanged a look. The old look. The one that said, "This is going to be uncomfortable." I continued before either of them could redirect. "You gave him $500,000, I said. "Not as help. As security. As belief." My mom opened her mouth, but I raised my hand slightly. "Please let me finish." They did. For once. "You told me I got something better," I said. "Lessons. Character. Independence." I paused, letting the words exist without softening them. That told me something very clear. That comfort is a reward in this family. And struggle is a tool. "That's not fair," my dad said immediately. "I know," I replied. "That's the point." My mom's eyes filled with tears, but I didn't stop. Not because I didn't care, but because I had spent my entire life stopping myself when they got emotional. "And before you say you love us equally," I added, "I believe you think you do. But love without support feels like distance. And distance, repeated long enough, becomes a message." "What message?" My mom whispered. "That I'm expected to endure, not receive," I said. "That I'm praised for surviving, not protected from harm." The room felt smaller. My dad leaned forward. "We didn't want you to depend on money," he said. "I didn't want to depend on you," I replied. "I wanted to know you'd show up if I needed you." That sentence landed differently. I could see it. Not understanding, but recognition. They had never considered that distinction. My mom wiped her eyes. "We thought we were doing the right thing," she said. "I know," I replied. "And that's what makes this hard. 'Cause intentions didn't erase outcomes. And love didn't cancel imbalance." "I'm not asking you to change the trust," I said calmly. "I'm not asking you to give me money." That seemed to confuse them even more. "Then what do you want?" my dad asked. "I want you to stop pretending this was neutral," I said. "I want you to acknowledge that you chose who would be cushioned and who would be tested." Silence stretched across the table. Not defensive silence. Not angry silence. The kind of silence that appears when there's nowhere left to hide. My dad finally spoke. "You've always been stronger," he said. There it was. The sentence that had followed me my entire life. "I know," I replied. "But strength shouldn't disqualify someone from care." My mom reached for my hand, then hesitated. "I don't know how to fix this," she said. "You can't," I replied gently. "But you can stop minimizing it." That was the moment everything shifted. Not because they apologized. They didn't. Not fully. But because I realized something crucial. I no longer needed them to understand in order to move forward. I had already said what needed to be said. Clearly, calmly, without begging, without anger. And that mattered more than any outcome. I stood up when the conversation ended. Not abruptly, not dramatically, just decisively. As I walked to the door, my dad said my name. I turned. He looked older than I remembered. Not weak. Just human. "I hope you know we never meant to hurt you," he said. I nodded. "I know," I replied. "But intention doesn't change impact." And then I left. Not feeling victorious. Not feeling defeated. Feeling complete. 'Cause for the first time I had spoken without shrinking. I hadn't asked for permission to be affected. I hadn't negotiated my pain into something more palatable. I had told the truth. And that truth didn't explode the family. Simply removed me from a position I was never meant to occupy. The position of the one who absorbs. The one who adapts. The one who survives so others can stay comfortable. As I drove home, I realized something quietly profound. That conversation wasn't the end of a relationship. It was the end of an illusion. And losing an illusion hurts. But keeping it costs even more. When I look back now, the most surprising part of all of this isn't the money. It's how long I believed that fairness was something I could earn if I just proved myself hard enough. For years, I thought resilience was my greatest strength. I wore it like armor. I let it define me. I believed that being adaptable, capable, and low maintenance made me easier to love. What I didn't realize was that it also made me easier to overlook. The $500,000 trust fund didn't break our family. It exposed it. It revealed a truth that had been quietly shaping my life long before any paperwork was signed. My brother was seen as someone whose future needed to be protected. I was seen as someone who could handle whatever came her way. That difference wasn't accidental. It was reinforced every time I was praised instead of supported. Every time I was encouraged instead of helped. Every time I was told that struggle was good for me while stability was reserved for someone else. For a long time, I confused endurance with virtue. I thought surviving without help meant I was doing something right. But survival is not the same as care. And endurance should never be the price of belonging. As the distance between my parents and me settled into something permanent, I began to understand how deeply their choices had shaped my inner world. I had learned to expect less without questioning why. I had learned to self-soothe instead of reaching out. I had learned to build my life in a constant state of readiness, always prepared for things to fall apart because no one was coming to catch me. That mindset didn't disappear overnight. Took time to unlearn. Took time to recognize when I was still living as if support was conditional. But slowly, deliberately, I began to replace it with something sturdier. Self-trust. Boundaries. A version of independence that wasn't rooted in abandonment. I stopped framing my story as one of deprivation. Not because it wasn't painful, but because pain wasn't the whole truth. Truth was that I had built a life from the ground up with nothing guaranteed. I had learned how to stand without leaning on anyone else. And while that shouldn't have been necessary, it did give me something invaluable. Choice. I could choose who had access to me. I could choose how much of my story I shared. I could choose a future that didn't depend on someone else deciding I was worth investing in. My parents never fully apologized. They never sat across from me and said, "We were wrong." They never acknowledged the imbalance in a way that brought closure. For a long time, I thought that meant the story would always feel unfinished. But I was wrong. Closure didn't come from their understanding. Came from my acceptance. Acceptance that they loved me in the way they knew how, not in the way I needed. Acceptance that fairness wasn't part of their framework. Acceptance that waiting for them to change would only keep me tied to disappointment. Once I accepted those things, something shifted permanently. I stopped measuring my worth against what they gave my brother. I stopped comparing my path to his. 'Cause comparison only makes sense when the starting lines are equal. And ours never were. I began to see my life not as the result of what I lacked, but as the result of what I chose to build anyway. Career shaped by discipline. A sense of stability earned through intention. A self-respect that didn't come from approval. I learned how to plan without fear. How to save without resentment. How to imagine a future that felt expansive instead of defensive. I stopped preparing for abandonment and started preparing for growth. That change was subtle at first. Then it was everything. There were moments when grief resurfaced. Holidays that felt quieter. Family gatherings I chose not to attend. Photos I saw secondhand. Those moments still hurt. But they no longer defined me. 'Cause pain, when acknowledged, loses its power to control. What replaced it was clarity. And clarity is one of the most freeing things a person can have. I understood, finally, that my parents had given my brother financial certainty. But certainty given can also be certainty controlled. What I was building for myself was slower, harder, less glamorous. But it was mine. Didn't depend on staying agreeable. Didn't disappear when I spoke up. Didn't come with lectures disguised as love. Came from alignment. From knowing exactly where I stood. From no longer needing to perform resilience to earn a place at the table. If there's one thing this experience taught me, it's this. Being strong should never mean being overlooked. Being independent should never mean being unsupported. And being family should never mean being the one who always absorbs the cost. My brother got a trust fund. I got something else. The freedom to define my own worth. Courage to stop accepting substitutes for care. And the certainty that my future belongs to me, not to the expectations or limitations of anyone else. I didn't walk away from my family in anger. I walked forward with clarity. And that clarity changed everything.